Moot Court event of the year. Thank you all for coming. This is the culmination of all of our work, so we're happy to celebrate that, and we have hopefully some great speeches tonight. I want to thank our amazing panelists for agreeing to spend their valuable time with us. We have a particularly interdisciplinary panel, which is kind of what the competition is all about. I think that's particularly appropriate. I also want to thank Danielle Volpe, next year's competitions assistant, for being so helpful in the process. Ben and Zahar, the incoming and outgoing EICs of Moot Court, for being wonderfully supportive, and everyone for participating, and everyone for coming. So without further ado, we will allow the competitors to give their speeches. And at the end, the judges will select first, second, and third place winner, and can, if they choose, offer the competitors some feedback. So the bailiff will be keeping time. She'll give each competitor the 1 minute mark and the stop mark. Right. Let the games begin.
My name is Joseph Kammerman. Whether a father should be obligated to pay child support for a child whose conception he did not consent to or have knowledge of is a question that evokes strong and divisive emotions. Calls for responsibility clash with claims to autonomy. Fairness pivots with perspectives. And when this question arises in the context of one mother and one father, both feel equally entitled to claim foul. However many forms this issue may arise in, its resolution is based neither on father's rights nor on mother's rights. I believe that both in the interest of children's rights, as well as a matter of practical public policy, non-consenting fathers should be required to pay child support. Children are born into this world vulnerable, not merely blameless, they are actless, innocent burdens. Legal theory and public policy often seek to protect the least blameworthy and most vulnerable among us. For example, the doctrine of the special relationship that finds affirmative obligations to act is based on this premise, and most agree that this principle is no more fittingly applied than to children. Thus, our society imposes on parents the natural duties of parental care. Sure, some other cultures approach child rearing differently. Even Plato promoted a republic where the state was solely responsible for raising children. But we have not asked our government to shoulder this responsibility, nor is it equipped to do so. Our courts and legislators hold that genetic parenthood presumptively creates parental obligations. That is the rule. For example, in most states, a surrogate mother has maternal rights if her egg is used in fertilization, despite any contractual agreements to the contrary. Moreover, a father cannot shield himself from parental responsibility simply because he pleads for a woman to terminate her pregnancy, even if that pregnancy was the result of a mutual mistake. In a more extreme example, a Kansas court held in 1993 that a 13-year-old male victim of statutory rape still owed parental responsibilities to his child. Furthermore, that victim had to repay the state for expenses accrued while public organizations stepped in for the incapable parents. Courts and legislators have made these decisions knowing that despite unfairness to the parents, the interests of the least blameworthy parties, the children, were supreme. Courts and legislators have also made these decisions based on an explicit desire to avoid having the state foot the bill for the absentee parents down the line. Now, underlying these conclusions is something deeper than a reliance on genetic testing or an interest in public finances. They derive from a commitment to the sanctity of life and an innate understanding that children are not commodities. They cannot be sold or discarded like assets. They cannot be traded at a discount like risky securities. And they cannot, simply by their existence, create liabilities like breached contracts or bad faith bargains. These principles are woven into much of our jurisprudence regarding parental obligations, and to reverse them could lead to an unraveling of our conception of what rights a child is owed by his or her parents. This reasoning explains that the best interest of the child doctrine is underpinned by both moral and practical concerns. The doctrine provides that the child's interests are paramount. If a child would otherwise be entitled to support from both parents, to support a child of these rights solely for the wrongs of his or her mother is an archaic and primitive approach to exacting justice. This doctrine, the best interest of the child, continues to apply in cases where a child is conceived via deceit. Though a father may have independent claims against a mother who conceives through a form of conceit, as seen in the Illinois 2005 decision, Philip v. Irons, the mother's liabilities towards the father do not indemnify him from his obligations to his child. Therefore, a father is ethically bound to provide child support when a child is conceived without his knowledge or consent, and the law should follow suit and maintain these obligations. Thank you.
I'm Sean Burston. Virtually all jurisdictions throughout the Union require that a man who has sex with a woman pay for child support should their coitus result in a baby. Justifications for the duty to pay child support abound. However, one reason for such liability is so elementary that it transcends many fields of law, and it meets no resistance to our basic concepts of common sense. A man who has vaginal intercourse with a woman is liable for child support because conception is a reasonably foreseeable consequence of that act. That fundamental principle does not apply to the scenario contemplated by the prompt. The question we're asked to answer is, should states allow a mother who conceives a child without the consent or knowledge of the father to recover child support? In endeavoring to answer the question before us today, one must first explain what has been asked. First, the question presumes, as a matter of fact, that a fraudulent conception does indeed exist. Therefore, we're not presented with any public policy concerns as to how a court would go about verifying the allegedly fraudulent conception. Second, the question covers several different types of potential scenarios. I'm going to discuss a recent case from the Florida Supreme Court involving two parties, let's call them John and Mary. John consensually ejaculated into Mary's mouth during oral sex. That was their first and last sexual interaction. 5 weeks later, Mary called John to advise him that he's the father of their baby. We needed the training of Einstein to know that conception was not a foreseeable consequence of that act. On the contrary, between John and Mary, it was impossible, without the superseding conduct of Mary, that she would conceive. Assuming, as the prompt requires, the truth of John's alleged fellatio turned human being, and further assuming that Mary, without John's consent or knowledge, cultivated the semen in order to conceive a child, should we make available the powerful force of the rule of law to Mary? Should the courts become the handmaiden of Mary's fraud? Should the system of justice subsidize the costs of Mary's misrepresentation? No, no, and no. Forced child support is designed to protect a consensually conceived child from men who simply wish to shirk their responsibilities. The coercive power of the state is not designed to ensure Mary's choice to clandestinely impregnate herself. Who better to pay the losses and costs of any decision than the decision maker? In those cases where a man and woman engage in consensual vaginal intercourse, both parties are duty-bound decision makers. But that's simply not the case for John and Mary. Not John, but Mary, and only Mary, can be said to have assumed the risk of conception. Just as divine laws and natural laws alike, so too should the laws of our government recognize that human beings can choose to or not to conceive a child. This panel will likely hear several arguments that the state should allow a mother to recover child support for her fraudulently conceived child. But how do those arguments reconcile both the unforeseeable consequences of an act and imposing liability for that act. Perhaps they're comfortable using the state to impose strict liability for the act of ejaculating. Either that, or they would disagree with the foreseeability analysis that I've presented, and they might contend that conception is a foreseeable consequence of fellatio. Puzzling? Not so for them. To answer yes to the question, one must be willing to establish as a matter of law that men must accept as reasonably foreseeable that a woman will cultivate semen and secretly impregnate herself. That would be a de jure principle that men must assume that there's a reasonable risk that a woman would do that. The other side of this debate may also seek to persuade you with examples of a woman who misrepresented her use of birth control. They will further argue that conception is always possible during vaginal intercourse, but that line of reasoning does not apply to the more troubling case of John and Mary. Was conception always a distinct possibility during their fellatio? Absolutely not. Cloaked beneath their altruistic concern for the child is a profound degradation of women. Such a rule would signal that a man who ejaculates must take extreme caution should there be a woman in sight. To be sure, both sides of this debate do agree most passionately as to one very important issue, and that is the welfare of the child. This nation of great wealth provides for each day the financial needs of the boys and girls of impoverished persons. So as for the child that Mary unilaterally chose to conceive, the state should not coerce John to pay for child support. Rather, Mary should be fully liable for those costs. If she's unable to pay, then the welfare power, not the coercive power of the state, should be invoked. Thank you.
Most important decisions that any of us have to make in our life is whether or not to have children. But what is also important, if not as important as that decision to have children, is who we choose to have them with. Now imagine for a second that somebody has stolen both of those vital decisions from you, and they did so through deceit and trickery. That is the situation that men in the United States are currently finding themselves in. And what have the courts done to remedy this injustice? They've actually forced these men, the victims of trickery and deceit, to pay. Now today we've been asked to address a surprisingly growing problem in this country. Whether women who conceive children without a father's knowledge or consent should be eligible to receive child support. Now, one of the most obvious questions that arise when you hear this issue is how could this even be possible? How could it be possible that a man could impregnate a woman and have absolutely no knowledge that it was happening and no consent was given? Well, for one, this very situation arises in circumstances of sexual assault. Now, it may be hard to imagine that a court could require a victim of sexual assault to endure a financial burden based on the crime committed against him, to require the victim to endure yet another hardship after being sexually assaulted. But that is exactly what courts in this country are currently doing. For instance, the Alabama Supreme Court forced a man who was sexually assaulted while he was incapacitated due to excessive drinking at a party to pay substantial child support, even after a jury found that he had involuntarily engaged in sexual activity with the woman while passed out. That man awoke the next morning from this party with his clothes completely off, only to find out a few weeks later that he had been sexually assaulted and that his assaulter was telling people that she got pregnant by assaulting him and that she was lucky she got to save herself a trip to the sperm bank. This again happened in Wisconsin, when the Court of Appeals in Wisconsin held that a man who had been slipped the date rape drug was also liable to pay child support, despite the fact that, again, a jury had found that he had involuntarily engaged in that activity when incapacitated. But perhaps one of the most bizarre situations where this incident occurs, where no consent or knowledge exists, is in instances where women actually steal sperm that has been purposely ejaculated outside of a female body and then personally inseminate themselves in order to become pregnant. For instance, in Louisiana, the court held that a man who had engaged only in oral sex with a woman was forced to pay child support because she, after they had done the act, stole his semen from the discarded condom and inseminated herself with a kitchen baster. Now, in all of these situations that can seem very troubling to the average person, the courts all relied on a strict liability standard. They held that the only thing that we should be concerned with is whether or not a female could prove that the father was actually the father based on a paternity test, and that it shouldn't be the child who suffers as a result of the mother's misgivings. And while this is a valid concern, to make sure that an innocent child, one simply born into these circumstances, is adequately taken care of, what these courts fail to acknowledge is that requiring a man to pay child support in every single instance, even when there are extraneous circumstances indicating that there was no consent or knowledge, is simply not necessary. Because as it has been shown, in situations where there is only a single parent, the state almost always covers any necessary needs of the child, any additional costs that may be required. Therefore, the only person who's actually suffering by not requiring a victim of sexual assault or deceit to pay is the state, not any child in desperate need. Additionally, if we are to allow women to use this type of deceit in order to impregnate themselves, all we are doing is incentivizing people to procreate in such a deceitful manner. If the state was willing to allow this to happen, rather than policing bad acts and putting deterrence and putting policies in place to deter such behavior, we would be leaving men with absolutely no protection from involuntarily taking on a significant financial and emotional burden of fathering a child against their will. What this boils down to is whether or not our society is willing and ready to put a substantial burden on men who either did nothing in order to engage in the pregnancy or only did acts that no reasonable person would ever anticipate would result in pregnancy. And whether we as a society are ready to condone such deceitful behavior. For the sake of all of us, I hope that the answer is a resounding no. Thank you.
My name is Marnie Isaacson. %17% of your income for 21 years, at the very least, in the state of New York. Today we are asked whether or not the state should allow a mother to recover child support when she conceives a child without the father's consent or knowledge. This question focuses our discussion to those cases where a woman so badly wants a child that she's willing to do whatever it takes. And when a woman makes that choice to conceive a child without the father's consent, without the father's knowledge, through trickery and bribery and deceit, then she should not be able to go to the courts and recover child support. to be clear, a woman should have the right to conceive a child if she so desires. And in the majority of those cases, if a woman conceives a child and the father is not present, she should be able to recover some form of support somewhere. But paternity alone cannot be a blanket ticket to ordering the payment of child support. If a child is conceived when a woman is sexually assaulted, the father, if found, should pay. Yet when a man is raped, the sex is considered voluntary, and the child support is ordered to be paid by the rape victim. In County of San Luis versus Nathaniel, a 15-year-old boy was ordered to pay child support and welfare reimbursement to a 34-year-old woman. Despite the fact that the sexual intercourse that led to conception was statutory rape, he was still ordered to pay because in California, the interest in providing equal payment for both parents outweighed his claims of statutory rape. And in a similar case, a 13-year-old boy was ordered to pay child support to his 17-year-old babysitter who conceived his child. Now, if a child is conceived through consensual sexual intercourse, again, child support can be paid to the mother. But if the father doesn't consent to, or even have knowledge to the fact that he's engaging in sexual intercourse, he's still ordered to pay. In State v. Broussard, the mother was a nurse's assistant who desperately wanted a child. Her husband was incarcerated and a drug addict, and time was running out. So she found a man who was visiting his sick parents nightly in the hospital, and she offered to engage in oral sex so long as he wore a condom. She then took his semen, harvested it, inseminated herself, and conceived the child. Now, despite the fact that the man never engaged in sexual intercourse, never gave his consent, and had no knowledge whatsoever of what was going on, and that the woman deceived him, the court still ordered him to pay $400 a month in child support and $18,000 in reimbursements. Even more troubling is the case of SF versus State, in which a mother conceived a child by having sexual intercourse with an unconscious man. This mother even told her friends that she had sex with him while he was passed out drunk. Quote, "He saved me a trip to the sperm bank." Now again, despite his lack of consciousness, consent, and knowledge, the court not only ordered him to pay $120 a month in child support, nearly $8,000 in back pay, but he also had to put that child on his health insurance. And we all know that that's another cost that most of us can't even bear for ourselves, let alone a child we have no knowledge of. Now, if that woman had gone to the sperm bank, she not only would have had to have paid for the semen and all medical costs accompanied with the pregnancy, but she, and she alone, would be responsible for all financial obligations for that child for its entire life. Moreover, when you receive sperm from a sperm bank, you have to sign a contract with a standard release form, which says that neither you, the recipient, nor any child born from that sperm can bring any claim whatsoever against the donor. It's ironic because in the case of the sperm bank, the sperm donor has consented to the use of the semen for conception. Moreover, he knows that the very purpose of his semen is to conceive a child. That's why he donates. And that's why we draw the line at the sperm bank donor. Because there's something intuitively wrong with holding a donor liable for child support payments for 21 years. Yet in the cases today, where there's no consent and no knowledge, and these women are essentially treating these men as sperm donors, courts are ordering them to pay child support. Now, I don't want to ignore a very valid argument, which is that any time you engage in sexual acts, arguably you are consenting and have knowledge that said acts could lead to conception. But let's be very frank here. Sexual intercourse is what leads to a child, not oral sex. Moreover, you cannot be said to have consented or even have knowledge to have engaged in sexual intercourse if you're unconscious. If you're a woman, that's rape. I mean, it's a message that we really want states to send, that despite your lack of consent and despite your lack of knowledge, if a woman somehow gets a hold of your semen and impregnates herself, we're now going to come after you for 17% of your income for 21 years? Is that the message? If a woman conceives a child while she's underage, that's statutory rape, and she should get support. But if a man is raped, and statutory rape, it's voluntary and he has to pay. If a woman is unconscious and she engages in sexual intercourse is had with her, that again is rape, and she should be entitled to support. But if a man is unconscious and he's raped, that's somehow voluntary and he has to pay. Even more so, if a man doesn't even engage in sexual intercourse, period, and his semen is somehow taken and inseminated in a woman, he still has to pay. Courts should not allow recovery when a man's sperm is essentially being used in the same way as a sperm donor, especially given the fact that we don't hold sperm donors liable. And they consented. They had knowledge. Where a woman is willing to pay the price of deception for the prize of conception, the man's price tag of 17% of his income over the course of 21 years is simply too high. Thank you.
My name is Akansha Mishra. Imagine your son, your brother. Imagine the most important male figure in your life who has hopes to someday be a father. Hopes and aspirations that were built upon the experiences of his own childhood growing up. Hopes and aspirations that were pursued responsibly through career choices, professional choices, important and calculated life decisions. And if you're a male sitting in this room with hopes to someday be a father, then think about yourself. Now imagine all of that being taken away from you, your vision of fatherhood shattered and permanently destroyed. Not because of a decision that you made, not because of any choice that you made, but because you had no choice. You had no decision when it came to paying child support for a child that you just weren't ready to father. Now, when a woman accidentally conceives a child with a man, she can decide to terminate her pregnancy. And that decision isn't transferable to a man. But a law that allows a woman who conceives a child without the consent or knowledge of the father to recover child support has an additional option. She can decide whether or not she's ready to be a mother, whether she has the means and the capacity to be a mother, whether her hopes and her aspirations have yet been crystallized at this moment of conception. But under this law, a man doesn't have that same decision. A man doesn't have the opportunity to decide whether or not he's ready to be a father, because he just is. Those important calculated life decisions that were once so vital in a man's life in assessing parenthood have been taken away. They've been stripped of, and they've been rendered meaningless at this point. Decisions like, am I ready to be a father? Am I at a point in my career where I can provide financially for a child? Am I old enough to be able to understand how to value and take care of a child? Could I protect a child from the evils of this world? Left defenseless under this law, these men have no choice. They have no decision. They don't get to choose parenthood as mothers get to choose motherhood. In fact, the only decision that they get to make at the point of conception under this law is the determination of what kind of father they're going to be. But bear in mind, this determination doesn't stem from the years of responsibility that they had hoped to achieve, of earning a salary, of pursuing a career, of finding a lifelong partner, of observing others and learning how to be a respectable, loving, and caring father. Instead, this decision comes from a phone call, A phone call telling your son, your friend, or even yourself that you now owe a paycheck every month and that you're now a father. Under this law, that's what parenthood becomes. That's what a father means. It's a formality, a surprise, resentment. Resentment that could very well lead to these fathers not wanting to be a part of their children's lives. In 2010, 13.7 million parents who had custody of 22 million children under the age of 21 lived apart from their parents, from their father. That's 22 million children under the age of 21 who didn't have the opportunity to sit down with their father every night at dinner, to learn from their father how to add, how to subtract, how to talk to a female, how to talk to a male, how to study for the SATs, how to apply for college, how to choose a major. Coerced parenthood under this law isn't a recipe for success. Children who live apart from their fathers are more likely to abuse alcohol and drugs. They're more likely to do poorly in school, to not have a successful future. They are more likely to kill themselves because they commit suicide. Forcing a man to be a father before he's ready not only takes away from the vitality of his life that he cherished so much, that he hoped for and aspired towards, but it leaves a child having an insecure and unstable future. Now, I wish that I could tell you that this isn't the reality under this law. I wish that I could tell you that this law, in fact, ensures that children will have the resources that they need to grow up, that it ensures family relations that our society thrives on, that being security and stability. I wish that I could tell you that, but you and I both know deep down that that isn't the reality. The reality is that when you coerce a human being to be in a situation that he never consented to, that he didn't have knowledge of, that's unfavorable to him, that he simply wasn't ready for, human emotions become involved, resentment follows, and instability ensues. That bond, that special bond that every child should have with their father, is severed. And that child himself or herself also has a vision to be a parent. But without the values of fatherhood, without having a father in that child's life, who knows what the consequences are for that child in the future? Is that really what we want for our children? Thank you.
Yana Velko.
Oh, okay. A father should be required to pay child support for a child that was conceived by his very own sperm, no matter what, unless we have two exceptions. Sexual assault, as was mentioned by my colleagues, should definitely be an exception for being forced to pay child support. And one other exception, which is if you conceive your child, with sperm banks. If you donate your sperm to a sperm bank, then obviously you're not held accountable. This is for two reasons. First of all, you signed a contract where you waived all your rights and obligations. Second of all, you're anonymous. Usually the female doesn't know about it, doesn't know who you are, neither does the child. Now, the reasoning for this rule, let's get back to the rule, stepping away from the exceptions, is really simple. You did the deed, now be the dad. It doesn't take rocket science to understand that. Everyone knows that the deed, namely sex, leads to conception. That is the way to conceive a child. Now, even if one claims that they didn't know and they didn't consent to the child at that moment when they were having sex with their girlfriend or a girl or a female, they should have known. They should have known that it was reasonably foreseeable. It was possible that they would conceive a child. They should have used the condom. In other words, the burden should be on the man to know that if he is engaging in sexual conduct, he might conceive a child. He should take all the responsibilities and use a condom. To have sex in reliance that the girl is protected is a faulty assumption. There's no way to ever guarantee that she's completely protected. Second of all, we know countless of cases where, despite protection, the girl conceived a child. Even if one claims that despite using a condom, the girl got pregnant, and the girl didn't either consent, and the girl didn't either have knowledge, because she did protect herself, and she really thought that she's not going to have a child. So now, we have both parties on equal playing field. They both had no knowledge or consent. Why do we give the man an advantage? The man doesn't have to go through the abortion. Not every woman is ready to go through abortion, whether it be religious values, whether it be personal ethics, and not every woman is prepared emotionally, mentally, and physically to go through with an abortion. And we've seen countless cases where women thought they were prepared, and then after, they regretted it. This rule would essentially be equating not wanting a pregnancy to being prepared emotionally, mentally, and physically to go through with an abortion. We would be forcing females to accept this. Now that we've established the duty of the sperm grantor, we can add and bolster this argument by adding in public policy. To allow a biological father to get away with child support due to lack of knowledge is completely against all public policy. It would open the floodgates where every guy can start claiming that he had no knowledge or consent. Now, if you say that there are cases with oral sex and then the woman inseminates herself, let's be real. What are the statistics? What happens more often? Who's usually the victim? The male or the female? Now, opening this floodgate is extremely dangerous. First of all, we're putting a subjective test, which the courts always try to avoid. Subjective tests will increase litigation. And most importantly, this places a much higher burden on the female to ensure consent and knowledge when having sex. Because if she is pregnant, she's left with two choices. Mothering the child alone, carrying the baggage alone, without a penny of child support, sending that kid to school, sending that kid to college, sending that kid to law school, all alone, without a penny of child support. Or she has an easy alternative, abort the kid. That is not an alternative for many people. Many people view that as killing. And people who don't view that as killing, and people who are pro-choice, even they can't guarantee the emotional, physical, and mental toll that an abortion will take on them. Now finally, if the court doesn't adopt this rule, and the court says that when we don't have knowledge and when we don't have consent, the father is spared from child support, the court would basically be implying that the child is more the mother's than it is the father's. Now this is unjust and inconsistent with the custody division upon divorce. Males are getting increasingly more and more rights to custody with 50-50 divisions. And with every right comes an obligation. Now, I've heard that an option that the states can get involved and enforce child support. I'm a single mom. I never received a penny of child support. And I don't have any state benefits to help me raise my child. I do it alone.
Terrell Watson, number 66. Our legal system is constantly called upon to preserve the rights of two groups, in part by balancing those rights against the rights of another group. An example of this would be the First Amendment, right? We each have the individual right to free speech. However, that right also needs to be balanced with another individual's rights not to be harmed by our speech, hence the need for defamation laws. Now, when dealing with certain family court issues, a very similar balance needs to take place. One interpretation of the question that's been presented here today raises the issue of balancing the right that adults have as to whether or not to conceive a child versus the rights that our children have to be protected financially when they are unable to protect themselves. And what this question presents is what happens when those two ideals fail to mix, sort of like oil and water. Well, medical advances have been able to help women who have been unable to conceive without having sexual relations with a male. And this is primarily done through in vitro fertilization, or IVF. But what happens when a woman who is in a relationship with her significant other proceeds to leave that relationship, go to a reproductive specialist, get inseminated with the sperm of a third party, and do this all behind the back of her significant other? Should she then be allowed to go after that significant other for child support? When I was first starting law school, I spoke to a friend of mine about family law. I told him my life goals and what I wanted to do. And he said, you know, family law is very easy. It's a very easy concept. If you want to get an A in every family law test, there's one answer. Do what's in the best interest of the child. Now, of course, you have to do your IRAC and things like that to go along with it. But is it as simple as that when a question like this is presented? Can we just simply say, we'll do what's in the best interest of the child? Well, various jurisdictions throughout the United States have had to grapple with this exact issue. And oftentimes, they have to put the greatest importance as to whether or not there was consent. There's an implication that if there is consent, whether oral or written, as to having IVF treatments, well, that trumps everything. That child is now considered legitimate of that couple's relationship. But for the purposes of our discussion here today, what happens when there is no consent? Well, the courts have had various different views on how to approach this. I'm going to streamline them. I'm going to ask certain questions. The first question that I think a court should consider is, what is the legal relationship between the couple? Are they married, in other words? And that's where I would place the greatest of importance. See, what if the child was conceived behind the back of her husband, or in the case of a same-sex relationship, of her wife? Well, I personally would draw a bright line rule that states when a couple is in a married relationship, there is an automatic presumption that that child be the legitimate child of that couple. Now, why? Now, that seems like a very harsh rule, and it puts our husbands and our significant others in a tough spot. Well, there's a couple of public policy arguments that I would cite. One, we consider the statistics of the rate of marriage in this country. And it's quite indicative of the fact that, unfortunately, it seems as if society is putting less of a value on marriage than maybe our parents or our grandparents may have placed on marriage. by implying that that child is now legitimate, it heightens the value that marriage should have in our society. It also protects our child. It tips that scale that we talked about back in the favor of doing what's in the best interest of our child. It protects them financially until they hit the age of majority. They'll be financially protected. Now that's an easy question as far as I'm concerned, if they were in a legal relationship. What if they're not? What if they're just boyfriend and girlfriend? How should we approach that question? Well, that can be very difficult to parse through, right? Because there are various different spectrums as to what constitutes a boyfriend and a girlfriend. Does a drunken rendezvous ending in a one-night stand now constitute a legal relationship? Well, the courts will probably find that no, that isn't the case. But imagine this scenario. Let's say a boyfriend and a girlfriend have been going out for a while. Now, after a while, the boyfriend decides, well, maybe it's time for this relationship to kind of slow down and maybe end. You know, she's got a little bit of issues. You know, one car short of a full deck, one french fry short of a Happy Meal. She's a little crazy, for the lack of a better term. And she gets wind that her boyfriend is going to break up with her. And as he's about to break up with her, she's like, no, you can't break up with me. And she runs. And as she's running, the boyfriend's like, what is she running for? She's running. She's saying, oh my goodness, you know what I'll do? You know what I'll do to keep him? I'm going to run to a reproductive specialist. I'm going to get artificially inseminated by a third party. I'm going to have his child, and then he can't leave me. Well, she comes back, and then he does break up with her, and she seeks to get child support from her boyfriend. Should she be allowed to do that? Well, there are various legal doctrines that come into play here. Let's say in this scenario, the boyfriend finds out that she conceives, he breaks up with her. 9 months later, he sees the little bundle of joy. He says, man, like, I don't have anything to do with you, but the baby. I just love this baby. I'm gonna take care of this baby as if it was my own. He takes care of the baby. He takes the baby to the doctor. Make sure the baby has clothes, Pampers. Make sure the baby is fed. He does this for a year, and all of a sudden he finds that this is a burden. So he says, I'm sorry, you gotta take this back. It's getting a little too expensive. I'm gonna go to law school now. Well, there are various legal doctrines that may protect the girlfriend in that situation and may allow the girlfriend to then recover child support from the boyfriend. For example, the courts have used doctrines of equitable estoppel, implied consent, and implied contract in order to put the burden on the boyfriend to now pay for this child. They have found that as crazy as the mother is, well, she did rely on the support that was coming in from the boyfriend. And that should count for something. So we're going to imply, as a matter of public policy, that this boyfriend should now take care of this child based on a contract theory. See, but let's say the same situation, but there's a little bit of a change. This guy is not as nice as we thought he was. Comes by 9 months after the child is conceived, sees the child, and he's like, whoop, no, didn't sign up for that, leaves the baby behind with the girlfriend. Well, various courts have found that there is no implied consent, there is no implied contract. There was nothing for this mother to rely upon. So, this baby now becomes the full burden of the girlfriend. I don't believe there's a truly perfect answer to this question. As stated through the second scenario of a boyfriend and a girlfriend, I believe that the courts really need to parse through the facts in a case like this. And of course, that doesn't promote judicial economy, but really, isn't our goal to really do that treasured family court doctrine of doing what's in the best interest of the child? So in summation, while I am in favor of a bright line rule making husbands or wives liable to their children for care, even though that child may have been conceived without the consent of their spouse, I believe that the courts do well to parse through the facts meticulously in a case where there is no legal relationship, to determine truly what's in the best interest of the child. And isn't that really what gets you an A on every family law exam?
Hi, my name is Suleiman Malik. This question boils down to this response. You are responsible for your actions. I'll start by saying that. Now I'll get down to the meat of my argument. What is consent in this question that's in front of us? A father has already given consent when he engages in the action of intercourse. Way before a mother comes up to him 9 months later and says, hey, you gotta pay child support now. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about it. Sorry I didn't Twitter it or Facebook it. Because that's what we do nowadays. He's already consented to a reasonably foreseeable consequence of his actions. So that's consent about it. A court in Illinois, the circuit court in Cook County, had a very interesting fact pattern before them. As colleagues have mentioned, a father had, he was a father. He was receiving oral sex, and the mother stole that sperm and impregnated herself. Father was held liable for child support. Let's also answer the other part of this question. Should states allow this to happen? Let me ask you guys this. You know who's responsible for child support if the father is not responsible in all of the cases? Everybody in this room is. You know how we are? The child is then left at the mercy of the welfare system, and all of us, as taxpayers, will now pay for John's, Joe's law school tuition. So that is what happens if we do not allow fathers to be held responsible for that very action. Furthermore, let's give you a fact pattern. The father has used a condom, he's used protection, the mother was on birth control. All of these scenarios, reasonably foreseeable that a child can be conceived. You know why? The perfect protection for sex is practicing abstinence. I learned that in my health class in high school. Now, let's turn to this other thing about trickery, deception, or stealing sperm at, let's say, Gotham Bar and Grill from a rich guy that comes in. This fact pattern in no way reduces that a child has been born. The role of a justice system is to protect and defend the person that is the weakest, and that is a child that is conceived. A justice system that prefers to deprive a child from adequate means of childcare is no justice system at all. 2 children, Anna, conceived from the father sexually assaulted. Jessica conceived from consent, which the father's given by the sheer action of intercourse. Anna still needs medical care, still needs food, still needs clothing. She was conceived through sexual assault. Jessica, conceived through consent, needs the same things. Medical clothing, food. Medical needs, food, clothing. They're the same needs, and a person involved in this action needs to pay child support, or else everybody in this room pays for child support as a tax-paying citizen. The states have an interest in this question that's posed before us. This is why in Circuit Court of Cook County, Irons versus Phillips, where the mother stole the sperm from someone that received oral sex, the father was still held for child support. Unless we have a means to create our welfare system better than it already is, and in a jurisdiction, let's say this hypothetical was in New York, our welfare system is completely out of whack. This should be the job of the legislature to then provide means for the welfare system. This is a question for a court, I presume. Courts should not be dealing with this question if that involved revamping the entire welfare system and making my tax dollars go up when I have to pay $50,000 to my law school tuition. I have great professors, by the way. But nevertheless, let's also, in conclusion, bring this point to something else. Allowing, or rather, having the father pay child support encourages two things. It encourages people to be responsible for their actions, and that's what we want in a society. Number two, it encourages the protection of the weakest person in any scenario you present in front of me. Whether you stole my sperm, whether you consensually had intercourse with me. It protects the person that is the weakest, and that is the child in any scenario. Cook County, in the circuit court in Cook County in Irons versus Phillips, had this exact scenario before them, and they still had the child being liable for child support, or the father being liable for child support. So in summation, with all of these points, a court cannot have the father neglect his responsibilities. And a mother that stole the sperm or anything of that sort, she's not going to be even able to raise a child herself, first of all. A mere payment of $170 a month, or however many percentage points of your income goes to that child, shouldn't take away from the fact that we need to provide for that child. Thank you very much for your times. Have a nice day.
All right, thank you everyone. That was very edifying. The judges, I suppose, can now retire to deliberate, and they can actually stay. Or can, not in a physical or metaphysical sense, they can announce their decision when they're ready.